Lieutenant Sarah Chen had always been different from other tank commanders. While her peers studied modern warfare tactics and digital systems, she spent her free time listening to her grandfather's stories about jungle warfare in Vietnam. The old man would sit on his porch smoking his pipe and tell her about fighting an enemy who seemed to appear from nowhere and disappear just as quickly. Her grandfather, Sergeant First Class Michael Chen, had served 3 tours in Vietnam as an infantry soldier. He taught her things they didn't cover in military academy: how to read the land like a book, how to use natural cover even when you think there isn't any, how to fight when your fancy equipment fails and all you have left is your brain and your will to survive. Sarah's unit, the 2nd Armored Division, was deployed to the desert region of Al-Anbar province in Iraq. The year was 2007, and insurgent attacks were becoming more sophisticated. Her M1A2 Abrams tank, nicknamed Iron Dragon, was equipped with the latest thermal imaging, GPS navigation, and communication systems. The crew trusted their technology completely. The mission seemed routine that morning. Intelligence reports indicated a small insurgent cell was operating from an abandoned village 30 kilometers northeast of their base. Sarah's tank would lead a convoy of 3 armored vehicles to investigate and neutralize any threats. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by rocky outcrops and the occasional cluster of mud brick buildings. Her crew consisted of 3 other soldiers she had trained with for months. Corporal James Martinez operated the main gun, while Private First Class David Kim handled the machine gun. Staff Sergeant Robert Williams served as her driver and had more combat experience than the rest of them combined. They worked together like clockwork, each knowing what the others would do before they did it. As they approached the target area, everything appeared normal through Sarah's periscope. The village looked exactly as described in their briefing reports. A few scattered buildings, some walls that had crumbled from years of neglect, and what appeared to be an old well in the center. The thermal imaging showed no heat signatures that would indicate human presence. Sarah ordered the convoy to halt at a safe distance, while she surveyed the area more carefully. Something felt wrong, though she couldn't identify exactly what was bothering her. The silence was too complete. Even abandoned places usually had some signs of life, birds or small animals moving about. Here, nothing stirred. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory from one of their many conversations. He had told her that in Vietnam, the most dangerous moments often came when everything seemed perfectly quiet and normal. The enemy was at their most deadly when they remained completely invisible, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The radio crackled with updates from the other vehicles in their small convoy. The crews reported normal readings on all their systems. Everything was functioning exactly as designed. Sarah made the decision to move closer to the village, maintaining communication with base command throughout their approach. As Iron Dragon rumbled forward across the sandy terrain, Sarah noticed her grandfather had taught her to spot details others might miss, the way certain rocks seemed positioned too perfectly along their route, how some of the debris around the village buildings appeared to have been recently disturbed. Small things that individually meant nothing, but together suggested human activity. The attack came without warning, just as they reached the village outskirts. A massive explosion erupted directly beneath Iron Dragon, lifting the 60-ton tank several feet into the air before slamming it back down. The impact threw everyone inside against the armored walls. Sarah's head struck her periscope mount, and bright lights flashed across her vision. When the ringing in her ears subsided enough for her to think clearly, Sarah realized their situation was far worse than just the initial blast. Every electronic system in the tank had gone completely dark. No thermal imaging, no GPS, no radio communication with base or the other vehicles. Even their engine had died, leaving them sitting motionless in an exposed position with no way to call for help. The silence inside Iron Dragon was more terrifying than any explosion. Sarah quickly checked on her crew members, finding them shaken but conscious. Martinez had a cut on his forehead from where his face hit the gun sight, while Kim was holding his shoulder where it had slammed against the ammunition storage. Williams was already trying to restart the engine, but nothing responded to his attempts. Sarah attempted to raise base command on their backup radio system, but even that was completely dead. The electromagnetic pulse from the improvised explosive device had been specifically designed to disable their electronic systems. This was not the work of amateur insurgents. Someone with sophisticated knowledge of American tank vulnerabilities had planned this attack very carefully. Through her periscope, Sarah could see movement in the buildings around them. Dark shapes flitted between doorways and windows, but she couldn't get a clear count of how many enemies they were facing. The other two vehicles in their convoy had stopped several hundred meters away, apparently unaffected by the electronic warfare attack that had disabled her tank. She tried to signal the other crews using hand gestures through her commander's hatch, but they seemed confused about what had happened to Iron Dragon. Without radio communication, there was no way to coordinate their response or call for immediate backup from their base. Sarah realized they were essentially on their own until her crew could figure out how to deal with their current situation. The sound of gunfire erupted from multiple directions at once. The insurgents had planned their ambush perfectly, waiting until the lead tank was disabled before revealing their positions. Sarah could hear bullets striking Iron Dragon's armor, but the thick steel plates were designed to withstand much heavier weapons than small arms fire. However, her grandfather's stories had taught her that the real danger in situations like this came from what you couldn't see, rather than what you could. The enemy would try to separate them from the other vehicles, then use rocket-propelled grenades or improvised explosive devices to finish them off. Time was working against them with every minute that passed. Williams finally gave up trying to restart the main engine and looked at Sarah with frustration written across his face. All their training had focused on using the tank's advanced systems to fight effectively. Without power, they couldn't rotate the turret, fire the main gun, or even operate their machine guns normally. They were trapped inside several tons of useless metal. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to remember everything her grandfather had told her about fighting when your equipment failed. He had survived 3 years in Vietnam using tactics that were hundreds of years old. Basic principles of warfare that worked regardless of technology. She needed to think like he had thought, see the battlefield the way he had seen it. Her grandfather always said the most important thing was to never let the enemy control the pace of the battle. If they wanted you to stay in one place, you had to move. If they expected you to run, you had to attack. The key was doing something they didn't anticipate, something that would disrupt their carefully planned ambush. Opening her eyes, Sarah began to study the terrain around their position with new understanding. The village was built on a slight rise in the landscape, with several natural drainage channels running away from it toward lower ground. Those channels would provide cover for movement, just like the stream beds her grandfather had used to move his squad through enemy territory. She explained her plan to the crew in quick, quiet sentences. They would abandon Iron Dragon and move on foot to a position where they could better coordinate with the other vehicles. It went against everything they had been taught about tank warfare, but their current situation was completely outside normal military doctrine. Martinez looked at her with disbelief when she finished explaining what she wanted to do. Leaving their armored protection to move across open ground seemed like suicide. Kim was nodding slowly, though, beginning to understand the logic behind her unconventional approach to their problem. Sarah knew they had only minutes before the enemy would escalate their attack. She could already hear the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds, which meant the insurgents had heavier weapons positioned somewhere nearby. Iron Dragon might be able to withstand small arms fire indefinitely, but a direct hit from a large mortar could crack even their thick armor plating. The first mortar round struck 50 meters to their left, sending up a fountain of sand and rock fragments that peppered Iron Dragon's hull. Sarah knew from her grandfather's descriptions that mortar teams usually fired 3 rounds to establish range, then followed up with sustained bombardment. They had perhaps 2 minutes before this position became completely untenable. Sarah grabbed her rifle and extra ammunition, then ordered her crew to prepare for immediate evacuation. Williams protested that abandoning their tank went against basic military protocol, but Sarah cut him off sharply. Protocol was written for situations where your equipment worked properly. Right now they were following older rules, the kind that had kept soldiers alive for centuries before tanks were ever invented. The crew gathered their weapons and essential gear while Sarah studied the drainage channel she had identified as their escape route. It ran roughly northeast from their current position, angling away from the village toward a cluster of larger rocks that could provide better defensive positions. The channel was deep enough to crawl through while remaining below ground level. As the second mortar round exploded closer to their position, Sarah made the decision to move immediately. She popped the commander's hatch and dropped out of the tank, followed quickly by her 3 crew members. The sound of gunfire increased dramatically as soon as the insurgents realized the Americans were abandoning their armored vehicle. Sarah led the way into the drainage channel, moving in a low crouch that kept them below the sight lines of the enemy shooters. Her grandfather had taught her that speed was more important than stealth when you were trying to break contact with an enemy. The longer you stayed in their kill zone, the more likely someone would get a lucky shot. Bullets whined overhead as they crawled through the sandy channel, but the insurgents were having difficulty tracking their exact position. The natural depression in the ground provided excellent concealment, exactly as her grandfather had described when he talked about using terrain features for protection. Modern soldiers relied too heavily on technology and forgot these basic survival techniques. Behind them, Iron Dragon took a direct hit from the 3rd mortar round. The explosion was tremendous, but Sarah knew the tank's armor would protect it from anything except the largest explosive devices. The real problem was that smoke from the burning diesel fuel would soon mark their last known position very clearly for the enemy spotters. After crawling for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the drainage channel deepened into a natural ravine that offered better protection. Sarah called a halt and raised her head carefully to observe their situation. They had successfully moved about 300 meters from Iron Dragon without taking casualties, but they were still well within range of enemy weapons. From this new position, Sarah could see the other 2 vehicles in their convoy more clearly. Both tanks appeared to be maneuvering to flank the village, but their movements seemed uncoordinated without radio communication. The crews were following standard doctrine, which called for suppressing enemy positions with heavy fire while waiting for reinforcements to arrive. Sarah realized that standard doctrine might not work in this situation. The insurgents had demonstrated sophisticated planning by disabling Iron Dragon with an electromagnetic pulse weapon. They probably had contingency plans for dealing with the remaining American vehicles as well. Her grandfather had always emphasized that you never fought the enemy's plan. You made them fight yours instead. She explained to her crew that they needed to get close enough to the other tanks to establish visual communication. The tank commanders would be watching for threats, and a series of hand signals could convey basic tactical information. More importantly, Sarah wanted to coordinate a different kind of attack than what the insurgents were expecting. Martinez questioned whether they could reach the other vehicles without being spotted by enemy fighters. The ground between their current position and the nearest tank was mostly open desert with very little cover. Sarah studied the terrain carefully, looking for the natural features her grandfather had taught her to identify. There was another shallow depression running roughly parallel to their current position, probably created by seasonal water runoff. It wouldn't provide as much concealment as the ravine they were hiding in, but it would give them a covered route to within signaling distance of the nearest tank. The key was timing their movement to avoid enemy observation. Sarah noticed that the insurgent gunfire was following a pattern, with heavier volumes during certain periods followed by lighter harassment fire. This suggested they were conserving ammunition for a sustained engagement, which meant they expected American reinforcements to arrive eventually. Her grandfather had explained that smart enemies always planned for the long battle, not just the initial contact. The pattern also meant there would be brief windows when fewer enemy fighters were actively engaging targets. During those periods, her crew could move more safely across the open ground toward their objective. Sarah began timing the cycles of gunfire, looking for the optimal moment to make their next move. During the next lull in enemy fire, Sarah led her crew out of the ravine and across the exposed ground toward the shallow depression she had identified. They moved in a dispersed formation, with each person taking a slightly different route to avoid presenting a concentrated target. Her grandfather had drilled into her that bunched-up soldiers were easy targets, while spread-out soldiers were much harder to hit effectively. The sprint across open ground felt endless, but they reached the new position without drawing concentrated fire. From here, Sarah could see the commander of the nearest tank, Staff Sergeant Collins, scanning the battlefield through his periscope. She began making the hand signals used for silent communication between armored units, trying to get his attention without exposing herself to enemy observation. It took several attempts, but Collins finally noticed her signals and responded with confirmation gestures. Sarah was able to convey that Iron Dragon was disabled, but her crew was intact and mobile. More importantly, she could indicate the general locations where she had observed enemy movement during their evacuation from the tank. Collins signaled back that he had been trying to reach base command for reinforcements, but their radio communications were being jammed. The insurgents had prepared for this engagement more thoroughly than anyone had anticipated. Without air support or additional ground forces, the remaining American vehicles would have to resolve the situation using only their immediate resources. Sarah studied the tactical situation from this new perspective and realized the enemy had made one critical error in their ambush planning. They had positioned most of their forces to engage targets approaching from the south, which was the direction American patrols normally used when investigating this area. However, the drainage channels and natural terrain features would allow a small ground force to approach from the east or north. Her grandfather had always taught her to look for what the enemy wasn't watching, rather than trying to fight through their strongest positions. The insurgents expected the Americans to rely on their superior firepower and technology to win this engagement. They weren't prepared for old-fashioned infantry tactics that used stealth and surprise instead of overwhelming force. Sarah signaled to Collins that she wanted to attempt a flanking maneuver with her crew while his tank provided covering fire. The plan was risky because it would separate her people even further from armored support, but it offered the best chance of disrupting the enemy ambush before they could bring their heavier weapons into effective range. Collins hesitated before responding to her proposal. Tank commanders were trained to keep their crews together and rely on combined arms tactics rather than individual initiative. What Sarah was suggesting went against established doctrine for dealing with complex ambush situations. However, their current circumstances were far from normal, and conventional approaches didn't seem to be working effectively. After a long moment, Collins signaled his agreement with Sarah's plan. He would coordinate with the third tank to provide suppressing fire on the known enemy positions, while Sarah's crew attempted to approach the village from an unexpected direction. The timing would be critical because the covering fire would alert the insurgents that something was about to happen. Sarah led her crew back through the ravine system, following the natural drainage patterns toward the northern side of the village. The route was longer and more difficult than a direct approach, but it offered concealment from enemy observation. Her grandfather had explained that the hardest path was often the safest, because enemies usually watch the easy approaches most carefully. As they moved through the network of channels and depressions, Sarah began to notice details that confirmed her suspicions about enemy preparations. There were disturbed areas in the sand that suggested weapon emplacements had been dug recently. Footprints indicated regular patrols between fighting positions. This was not a random encounter, but a carefully orchestrated trap. The insurgents had been planning this ambush for days or possibly weeks, studying American patrol patterns and preparing multiple defensive positions. They had brought electromagnetic warfare equipment specifically designed to disable tank systems. Most importantly, they had positioned their forces to take advantage of the American tendency to rely on technology rather than basic fieldcraft to her. Grandfather's voice seemed to whisper in her ear as they approached the northern edge of the village. He had survived Vietnam by remembering that every enemy fighter was a human being with strengths and weaknesses, not some invincible force. The insurgents were well prepared and determined, but they could still make mistakes if pressure was applied from unexpected directions. Sarah could hear the sound of sustained gunfire as Collins and the other tank began their covering fire mission. The noise would mask any sounds her crew made while approaching their target, but it also meant the enemy would be on high alert for exactly the kind of flanking movement she was attempting. Everything now depended on reaching an effective position before the insurgents realized what was happening. The covering fire from the American tanks was working exactly as Sarah had hoped. The insurgents were focused on returning fire toward their main threat, which gave her crew the opportunity to approach from the blind side of their defensive positions. Through careful observation, Sarah could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different enemy fighting positions scattered throughout the village. Buildings. Her grandfather had taught her that successful attacks required patience and timing rather than aggressive action. The enemy fighters were experienced and well-disciplined, but they were also human beings who would eventually make small mistakes. Sarah positioned her crew in a concealed location where they could observe enemy movements and wait for the right moment to strike. From their hidden position behind a collapsed wall, Sarah could see two insurgents operating a mortar in the courtyard of what had once been someone's home. They were methodically adjusting their aim between shots, trying to bracket the American tanks with increasingly accurate fire. These were the soldiers who posed the greatest immediate threat to Collins and his crew. Williams whispered that they should call for artillery support to deal with the mortar team, but Sarah shook her head. They had no radio communication, and even if they did, friendly fire was always a risk when operating this close to enemy positions. Her grandfather had survived Vietnam using rifles and grenades, not by calling in airstrikes that might kill his own people. Sarah studied the layout of the enemy positions and identified what her grandfather would have called their center of gravity. The insurgents had positioned their command element in a large building that offered good observation of the entire battlefield. If that position could be neutralized, the remaining fighters would lose coordination and become much easier targets for the American tanks. She explained her plan to Martinez, Kim, and Williams in quick whispers. They would split into two teams and approach the command building from different directions simultaneously. The mortar team would be their secondary objective, but the priority was disrupting enemy command and control. Once confusion set in among the insurgent fighters, Collins could advance his tanks more aggressively. Martinez and Kim would approach from the east, using the ruins of several smaller buildings for concealment. Sarah and Williams would circle around to approach from the west, where a partially collapsed wall would provide cover almost to the edge of the command building. Both teams would wait for Sarah's signal before initiating contact with enemy forces. The movement to their assault positions required careful timing to avoid enemy observation. Sarah and Williams crawled through rubble and debris, stopping frequently to listen for sounds that might indicate they had been detected. The noise from ongoing gunfire helped mask their approach, but it also made it difficult to hear potential threats from other directions. As they reached their final position, Sarah could see through a gap in the wall that the enemy command post contained at least 4 fighters and sophisticated communication equipment. One man appeared to be coordinating the overall defense while others relayed orders to fighting positions throughout the village. These were not amateur insurgents but experienced soldiers who understood military tactics. Sarah checked her watch and saw that they had been engaged for almost an hour. American reinforcements would probably arrive within the next 30 minutes, but Collins and his crew might not survive that long if the mortar fire became more accurate. The enemy commanders seemed confident in their ability to destroy the remaining American vehicles before help could arrive. Through hand signals, Sarah confirmed that Martinez and Kim were in position and ready to begin their part of the assault. The timing would be critical, because they would have only seconds of surprise before the enemy fighters realized what was happening. Her grandfather had always emphasized that violence of action was more important than perfect planning when conducting close quarters combat. Sarah took a deep breath and remembered her grandfather, his final piece of advice about fighting in impossible situations. He had told her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite being afraid. Every soldier felt scared in combat, but the ones who survived were those who could still think clearly and make good decisions while terrified. The sound of the American tanks covering fire suddenly increased in intensity, suggesting that Collins was preparing for some kind of assault. This would be the perfect time to attack the command building, because the enemy leaders would be focused on coordinating their response to the tank threat. Sarah gripped her rifle tightly and prepared to give the signal that would begin their assault. In the distance, she could hear the distinctive sound of helicopters approaching their position. American reinforcements were finally arriving, but they were still several minutes away from being able to provide effective support. Sarah's crew would have to complete their mission using only their rifles and grenades, just as her grandfather had fought with his squad more than 40 years earlier in the jungles of Vietnam. Sarah raised her hand and gave the attack signal, then immediately opened fire on the enemy command position. Her first shots took down the fighter who appeared to be the senior leader, creating instant confusion among the remaining insurgents. Williams engaged targets on the opposite side of the building while Martinez and Kim began their assault from the eastern approach. The surprise was complete, but brief. Within seconds, enemy fighters throughout the village realized they were under attack from ground forces operating inside their defensive perimeter. The carefully coordinated ambush began to break down as individual fighting positions tried to redirect their fire toward multiple threats approaching from unexpected directions. Sarah and Williams advanced through the gap in the wall, using short rushes between cover to close the distance to their target building. Enemy fighters were shouting orders in Arabic, but the coordination that had made their ambush so effective was rapidly deteriorating. Without their command element, the remaining insurgents were fighting as individuals rather than as an organized unit. The mortar team had stopped firing at the American tanks and was trying to relocate their weapon to a position where they could support their embattled comrades. Sarah could see them struggling to move the heavy equipment while under fire from Martinez and Kim, who had successfully reached their assault position on the eastern side of the command building. A burst of automatic weapons fire from inside the building forced Sarah to dive behind a pile of rubble. The remaining enemy fighters in the command post were determined to hold their position, and they had good fields of fire covering all the obvious approaches. Sarah realized they would need to use grenades to clear the building, which carried the risk of destroying valuable intelligence materials. Williams had worked his way around to a position where he could see into the building through a partially collapsed wall. He signaled to Sarah that he could count 3 enemy fighters still active inside the command post, but they were well positioned behind heavy furniture and debris that would provide protection against small arms fire. The situation called for decisive action before reinforcements could arrive to help the insurgents. Sarah pulled a fragmentation grenade from her equipment and prepared to throw it through the main entrance to the building. Her grandfather had taught her that hesitation in close combat usually meant death for everyone involved. Once you committed to an assault, you had to follow through with overwhelming violence until the enemy was completely neutralized. The explosion of her grenade was followed immediately by a second blast as Williams threw his own grenade through the gap he had been observing. The double concussion stunned the remaining enemy fighters long enough for Sarah and Martinez to rush the building from opposite directions. The final moments of fighting were brief and decisive. With the command post neutralized, the remaining insurgent positions throughout the village began to lose their coordination and effectiveness. Some fighters attempted to withdraw toward prepared escape routes, while others continued firing from fixed positions that were now isolated and vulnerable to attack from the advancing American tanks. Collins had observed the success of Sarah's ground assault and was moving his tank forward more aggressively, using his main gun to engage enemy positions that had previously been too well concealed to target effectively. The third tank in their convoy was providing overwatch and preventing enemy fighters from reorganizing their defense of the village. Sarah gathered her crew at the captured command post and began searching for intelligence materials that might reveal information about other planned attacks. The insurgents had maintained detailed maps showing American patrol routes and base locations, along with communication equipment that was more sophisticated than anything they had encountered in previous engagements. The approaching helicopters were now close, enough to provide close air support if needed. But the battle was essentially over. The surviving insurgents were withdrawing from the village using escape routes that led into rocky terrain, where vehicles could not follow effectively. Sarah's unconventional tactics had successfully broken up a well-planned ambush that could have resulted in significant American casualties. As the immediate threat diminished, Sarah reflected on how her grandfather's combat wisdom had proven relevant in a completely different war fought with completely different technology. The basic principles of infantry tactics had not changed significantly since Vietnam, even though the weapons and communication systems had advanced dramatically over the intervening decades. Williams was examining the electromagnetic pulse device that had disabled Iron Dragon, trying to understand how the insurgents had acquired such sophisticated equipment. The device was clearly manufactured rather than improvised, which suggested the enemy had access to advanced technology and professional military training that exceeded their previous capabilities. Sarah realized that this engagement represented a significant escalation in insurgent tactics and capabilities. The enemy was adapting to American advantages in technology and firepower by developing countermeasures that forced American forces to rely on basic military skills rather than superior equipment. Her grandfather's Vietnam War experiences had suddenly become very relevant to modern combat operations. The helicopter gunships arrived just as the last insurgent fighters were disappearing into the rocky terrain beyond the village. Sarah coordinated with the air crews using handheld radios recovered from the enemy command post. directing them toward the escape routes the surviving fighters were using. However, the helicopters reported that the insurgents had scattered into small groups that were difficult to track from the air. Collins brought his tank forward to Sarah's position, and she was finally able to establish radio communication with their base command. The report she gave was unlike anything the intelligence officers had heard before. The enemy had demonstrated capabilities and coordination that suggested outside training and equipment support from sources much more sophisticated than local insurgent groups. Investigation of Iron Dragon revealed that the electromagnetic pulse device had been specifically designed to target American tank electronics without causing permanent damage to the vehicle's basic systems. This was not random sabotage, but sophisticated electronic warfare conducted by people who understood both American equipment capabilities and vulnerabilities. The implications were disturbing for future operations in the region. Sarah's crew was evacuated to base for medical evaluation and debriefing, but none of them had sustained serious injuries during the engagement. The successful outcome had resulted primarily from their willingness to abandon standard operating procedures and adapt to circumstances using unconventional tactics. Military analysts would spend months studying the engagement to understand its broader implications. During her formal debriefing, Sarah explained how her grandfather's Vietnam War experiences had influenced her tactical decisions throughout the battle. The questioning officers were initially skeptical that 40-year-old combat techniques could be relevant to modern warfare, but the results spoke for themselves. Her crew had neutralized a sophisticated ambush using nothing more than rifles, grenades, and infantry tactics. The intelligence materials recovered from the enemy command post revealed a network of planned attacks against American forces throughout the region. The insurgents had been conducting detailed surveillance of patrol patterns, base security procedures, and equipment vulnerabilities. The information suggested that this engagement was part of a much larger, coordinated campaign rather than an isolated incident. Sarah's after-action report recommended that American forces receive additional training in basic infantry tactics and equipment-independent combat skills. Too many soldiers had become dependent on technology and communication systems that could be compromised by increasingly sophisticated enemy capabilities. The lessons her grandfather had learned in Vietnam needed to be relearned by a new generation of warriors. 3 weeks later, Sarah received a letter from her grandfather after news of her actions had reached him through military channels. He wrote that he was proud of her for remembering the lessons he had tried to teach her, but more importantly, he was proud that she had been able to bring all her soldiers home safely. That was the ultimate measure of success in combat leadership. Iron Dragon was repaired and returned to service with upgraded electromagnetic shielding and backup systems that would prevent similar electronic warfare attacks. However, Sarah requested that her crew also receive additional training in operating the tank manually without computer assistance. The next enemy might have even more sophisticated countermeasures that could defeat any technological protection. The engagement became a case study taught at military academies and tank schools. Throughout the American Armed Forces, students learned about the importance of maintaining basic combat skills even in an age of advanced technology. More importantly, they learned about the value of unconventional thinking when facing enemies who had studied American tactics and developed specific countermeasures. Sarah was promoted to captain and given command of a larger unit, but she never forgot the lessons learned during those desperate hours when her tank systems were offline. She made sure every soldier under her command received training in the fundamental tactics that had kept American soldiers alive in conflicts from Vietnam to Iraq. Technology was a powerful advantage, but it was never a substitute for good leadership and tactical flexibility. Years later, when Sarah had grandchildren of her own, she would tell them stories about the day she learned that some kinds of wisdom never become obsolete. Her grandfather's combat experiences from a different war in a different time had saved her life and the lives of her crew. The basic principles of courage, leadership, and tactical thinking remained constant even as technology continued to advance at an incredible pace.